provide an invalid encryption key that wouldn't work. Facebook, for example, could have a bug where all the privacy settings no longer get followed and everything would be open. So the customer controlling privacy always trusts the provider and trust the provider in a way that is not verifiable. You cannot go and scrutinize Facebook's server-side code. It's not inherently made available to you. While if it's happening on the client side, it would be scrutinizable because it has to run on your machine.
So I just want to talk to the point, pooling. Just what you were saying about privacy controls, so there's two things here. We had a really good discussion at Intac on day one around authentication. Our group split off and we talked about authentication, and we sort of honed in on the RealMe iGov service. And it kind of was sold to me, I mean, I'm no expert in it, but it was sold to me as sort of becoming an online portfolio store of which government organizations were allowed to have access to information. So in terms of the privacy controls, I mean, I've kind of been involved with understanding Bitcoin. And Bitcoin's a really interesting algorithm in terms of the fact that you have this record of authentication effectively, and that's completely public and distributed. So I guess going back to the iGov tie-in, we sort of thought something like a one-time auth system like Bitcoin would be actually really good for allowing and disallowing transactions on your personal data as a way of doing it distributed, making sure that you don't end up with bugs like Dropbox's bug. The second point I want to talk about is the Facebook issue. I actually left Facebook 2 years ago when they changed their privacy settings to become more granular. What would happen is I kind of treat my online profiles as a public place, and Facebook over several years made it harder and harder to get the data that I was putting in, and people were adding to conversation on wall posts. Made it really hard to get it out. The final straw was when they introduced the last set of privacy changes. If someone commented on a public wall post and they had high privacy settings, suddenly their comments were no longer available to be indexed. People can see them if you leave Facebook. Anyone who's untagged themselves in your photos, suddenly the photo is no longer available to be downloaded. And that really irked me. So I think that it swings the other way as well, right? You should have the ability to completely open up things. Just because it's in someone's walled garden, it shouldn't mean that someone who doesn't want to be involved in that conversation because it's joined in anyway should have the ability to stop you from having that conversation.
That's right. Also bear in mind that privacy by policy does not apply to government activity. So I'm pretty sure that the PRISM interface to Facebook is not adhering to the privacy settings of the users that they grab the data from.
So, talking a little bit about the design issues, I mean, obviously PRISM brings this up a bit, the need to figure out the line between metadata and what the end-to-end encryption is actually able to protect. I'm curious in general, how people who are designing platforms like this are designing for, or if they're designing for kind of minimal metadata to be exposed. I mean, on one end of the spectrum, we have email, which basically, by design, exposes absolutely everything. Like, there's no way, like, it draws an outline around the message and gives everything else out to the network. And then at the other end, we have services like CryptoCat or something like that, where very little metadata is really opened out to the net. So I guess this is in two parts. One is, how do you design for minimizing the leakage of metadata? And the second is, have you put out there any public documentation for users about what metadata you do end up storing that you could, say, respond to a law enforcement request with?
Okay, first, the operational requirements of maintaining an email address to contact the user or to send packets to user require the site's operator to at least temporarily have the email address or the IP address of the client. There's no way around that operationally, so unfortunately that is the minimum set of metadata that you have to maintain. And you usually would store, according with the retention laws of the jurisdictions that you operate in, And that can mean that in some jurisdictions you have to store it for 6 months, log files of all transactions. And there's simply no way around that if you want to be compliant with local laws. And the way around that is to have people, and that's not something that the operator of the site would be responsible for or would endorse or would explicitly give users instructions on how to do, but users would have to learn, if they want to have privacy and anonymity, they would have to learn how to use, for example, Tor or really anonymous email services and combine that with the privacy of storage. Then they have privacy and anonymity combined. A service that operates within the space of the law needs to maintain certain metadata and make it available to law enforcement. That's the unfortunate fact. Otherwise, it could get into legal trouble. As far as publication is concerned, we will make that available in detail quite soon. But it is quite obvious that we have to store the email address. We also show to the user when he goes to his account page the history of his sessions with the IP addresses. So it's quite obvious to the user that there is a certain retention of metadata, and it should also serve as a warning that privacy does not equal anonymity.
Mathias, you mentioned Tor. That's something that's come up a few times over the last few days, and I just learned this morning what it was. Could you explain what Tor is?
Tor is basically a piece of software that allows connections to be routed through a multitude of intermediaries, and its strength comes from the fact that there is a large amount of nodes operating together, and the routing of the information being randomized. So you enter the Tor network through a node and you exit it through a node, but it is exceedingly hard to tell which entry or which communication at the entry point corresponds to which communication at the exit point. This makes it very difficult for law enforcement to actually track what's happening through the Tor network. And funnily enough, as an anecdote, we have learned that law enforcement used Tor for anonymous investigations against us. So that we wouldn't know that the IP address is from Virginia or something like that.
Hi, Andrew Chilton from Mozilla. Just to talk briefly about your point about metadata. So one of the things you were asking about metadata is we've got a service called Persona which allows you to authenticate and log into websites. So for example, instead of using Facebook or Twitter login, you could use Persona. And one of the things we do end-to-end encryption between all parties. No party actually knows ever gets to obtain the full amount of data, so it's all between the different parties. And the other thing is with the metadata, it's one of the things that I find that we don't actually discuss as much as we should, is actually the less you log, the better. And as you say, there's lots of things that you might have to log certain things, but generally most sites log too much information. And data itself, whether it's encrypted or not, if it's just sitting there, it's actually more dangerous than we care to acknowledge sometimes. So yeah, essentially the minimum amount of logging, the better in most cases like that.
Right. Log as much
I'm sorry,
as you
there was
have
no
to.
question there.
Right. Log as much as you have to, but don't log more than you have to.
Yeah.
That's the basic rule. But you have to log a lot. That's important.
One quick note on that, though, about designing for metadata privacy, is that, this may be more of a statement for your question as well, is that there are technical measures you can take to resist things like timing attacks and length of message, kind of looking at length of message. And I am curious whether that's actually a concern that's on the radar of people designing things in this room. That would be no.
It's not really on our radar because it would be quite difficult to make these kinds of attacks on our model, but it's indeed true that length of message you could compress and make it more difficult, but still, length of message attacks are, to a limited extent, a risk to encrypted communication.
Can I just ask here, who's looking at length of message attacks at all? Is anybody interested in that issue or been working on that issue? Would people like to know more about that?
Actually, one of the pieces of metadata that we store unencrypted is the size of a file, which does not get altered by the encryption. So indeed, there is a concern that if there is a huge file that has a very unique length stored on our service and it's found elsewhere, then there could be a correlation between the two. So if you want to ensure privacy, then add a bit of garbage at the end of your files before uploading them.
Many years ago, back in the 90s, we created X25 public key cryptography system, which we had hardware keys also testing during the transfers, whether there was a man-in-the-middle attack. But what we were doing in the other side of things was actually introducing random data into the packets that were being transmitted. So if the same packet was being retransmitted using the same keys, we would basically wind up with different results. So, you know, as a provider, wouldn't you be able to add random data that can then be pulled at a particular moment in time to obfuscate, you know, that issue?
Yes, we don't have the situation where file payload data is encrypted with the same key and the same initialization vector twice. So that would not be a problem. Even if you upload the same file multiple times, it would be completely different every time. But padding, random padding is, for example, used in the constellation of encrypting to an RSA public key, and that makes it, that's a very important part of the RSA public key encryption. Thank you.
Alistair Thompson from Scoop again. Taz, can you tell us a little bit about MegaMail and the privacy by design considerations which are going into that?
That product is still in the process of being developed. However, of course, the basic issue with private or encrypted email is that the general email infrastructure does not go well with encryption. You have to, if you want to reach all email addresses, you have to send your mail unencrypted, plain text, from some server. You could integrate PGP or S-MIME support, but then you lose a large percentage of the emailing public. So it's not as useful as it would be if it was compatible with every email address. And the only secure way is actually making it PGP style, which exists since a long time, but really didn't gain that much market share because it's too complicated. People don't want to deal with the complexities of PGP, although it's really user-friendly. So you see even the slightest burden on a user already makes it much less likely for people to use encryption. And therefore it will initially be most likely a closed shop solution where it's a site internal messaging between users, and how to open it up to the emailing public, to general email addresses without compromising the cryptographic end-to-end principle is still a matter that's being discussed.
Kia ora, Joe Pauling. So I guess we've started talking about stenography really in the last comments coming through. I guess that would be a service I'd pay for. I mean, if you could give me plausible deniability inside of the secure end-to-end service for file store, if you could tick a box and then let me download a key which I could then give to other people and say, you need to have this key to unlock the steno that's inside the end-to-end encrypted, that'd be something I'd pay for, but would there be something that you would do because of legal obligations?
It's not something that we have on our radar right now. It's more for the third-party developers that are using our API, our SDK, and would like to provide products like that. We don't see it as a integral part of our service offering right now.
Hello, in the absence of for the ambitions. What about mega voice communications in browsers?
That's another interesting topic. Basically, Skype does, in theory, do the right thing. They exchange one-time session keys through public key cryptography and then encrypt your communication using those keys. However, unfortunately, Skype is now too big, and they're on the radar, of course, of authorities, and they were pressured into providing backdoors. So again, an open source solution is the way to go that would expose any backdoors to inclined security researchers. There are open source solutions like that in the market already, and they're probably getting used quite a bit. But having something integrated in your browser that is easy to use, doesn't require any installation of tools on your machine, would be very desirable. And browsers only recently start coming along in terms of features where it is possible to get audio-video communication from your microphone, from your built-in cameras, and get that into JavaScript to make it subject to encryption is just something that browsers have learned recently, and we will make use of it soon enough.
Google will make use of it?
WebRTC. So it's basically Chrome and Firefox have introduced that. Microsoft is doing their own thing again, so it will be kind of difficult to interoperate between the two worlds, but eventually will be useful as an additional feature using the existing user accounts and their public keys, and to have an additional layer of communication that's subject to encryption, open source encryption.
Alec Wilson, I have a question about whether we can rely upon the integrity of proprietary web browsers such as Microsoft's Internet Explorer to not have backdoors that allow them to get into plugins that provide end-to-end voice security, for example.
Excellent question. Of course, the endpoint security is paramount. Any secure crypto system is useless if the endpoint has been compromised in any way. This could be through the web browsers, could be through a backdoor in the browser itself. It's very unlikely with Firefox being open source. It's much more likely with IE. It's semi-likely with Chrome. Of course, Google having their hands in there already guarantees a certain amount of backdooring, but that's more for commercial purposes. That is not limited to the browser itself. Of course, any operating system has to be secure. As soon as you start having a keylogger on your machine or any kind of backdoor, your entire cryptographic security falls apart. And with it, the security of participants in shared folders, for example, if you have files in a shared folder that you share with someone who is a victim to spyware on this machine, the entire security of your files, as encrypted as they may be on the server, falls apart.
Is it just with that particular exchange, or is it in general?
Sorry?
That encryption falls apart when you share a folder with somebody. For everything, or just for that particular?
Well, folder sharing works by transmitting a secret through asymmetric cryptography, and then basically encrypting everything with that secret, so that you exchange a secret once with a very slow asymmetric cryptography, and then it's the standard way of conveying a secret to a peer. And after that, the contents of that folder is basically readable by everyone who has that common secret. And if one of those parties, each chain only being as strong as its weakest link, if one of the parties somehow leaks that key, everything in that shared folder is compromised.
Hi there. I'd be interested in your views, or anyone's views, on some of the major social hurdles to adoption, widespread adoption of cryptographic products, whether it's securing your email, whether it's commercial services, whether it's private services.
Anything that's hard to use will not be used. That is the bottom line. So it's important that even the requirement to install something on your computer is actually quite a big hurdle, because installing a binary on your machine means that you trust the vendor completely. A binary could contain any kind of malicious activity, and you cannot easily scrutinize a binary for such components. So it almost